In the end months of World War II, the United States accomplished something so unusual that even today it remains difficult to fully comprehend. Entire German armies surrendered not after devastating battles, not after cities were reduced to rubble, and not after overwhelming firepower forced them into submission. In many cases, they surrendered without a single shot being fired. Columns of German soldiers, battle-hardened veterans of years of brutal warfare, laid down their weapons, raised their hands, and walked silently into American custody. This was not a collapse caused by fear in the traditional sense. It was the result of a deeper realization. The war was no longer being fought on the battlefield. It had become a system, and the United States controlled that system completely. By early 1945, Germany was no longer a functioning war machine. It was a structure hollowed out from the inside. Allied forces pressed relentlessly from the West with precision, coordination, and logistical superiority, while the Soviet army advanced from the East with overwhelming brutality. Between these two forces, the German military found itself crushed, fragmented, and leaderless. Communication lines were severed, supply routes were destroyed, and entire units operated without knowing where friendly forces were or if they still existed at all. But more than bombs or tanks, it was information that destroyed morale. German soldiers understood that the outcome of the war was already decided. The only remaining question was how much suffering remained between them and survival. As the Eastern Front collapsed, a silent calculation began inside the minds of millions of German soldiers. They knew what surrender meant, but more importantly, they knew to whom they surrendered mattered more than the act itself. Stories spread rapidly through retreating units. Some were first-hand accounts, others rumors amplified by fear. Prisoners taken by Soviet forces often disappeared. Entire units vanished without explanation. By contrast, American captivity had a reputation. Prisoners received food, medical care, shelter, order. For exhausted men who had lived for years under constant bombardment, starvation, and uncertainty, the American uniform came to symbolize not defeat, but the end of chaos. This understanding triggered what historians later called the race to the West. German soldiers abandoned defensive positions that had taken months to build. They sabotaged their own heavy equipment to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. Tanks were destroyed, artillery was abandoned, and vehicles were burned by their own crews. These men were not fleeing in panic, they were moving with purpose. Every step westward increased their chances of survival. Every mile away from the Eastern Front felt like reclaiming control over their fate. In many cases, German units maneuvered specifically to intersect American lines, even if it meant exposing themselves to danger along the way. The culmination of this mass movement occurred in the Ruhr region, the industrial heart of Germany and one of the most heavily fortified areas in Europe. In March 1945, American forces encircled the Ruhr pocket, trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers inside. Adolf Hitler issued orders forbidding surrender or organized withdrawal. He demanded total resistance, but his words no longer carried authority. Inside the pocket, German commanders faced an impossible situation. Supplies were gone, ammunition was low, communications had collapsed. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies. There was no path to victory, only a choice between meaningless death and survival. What followed was unprecedented. Entire divisions surrendered at once, not battalions, not companies, divisions. Roads became rivers of men walking toward American positions, weapons discarded, helmets hanging loosely from their hands. White flags appeared everywhere, on vehicles, on buildings, on makeshift poles held aloft by soldiers who had stopped pretending the war still existed. There were no dramatic final stands, no last heroic charges. The fighting simply ended. By the end of March 1945, more than 1.3 million German soldiers had surrendered since D-Day, many without ever firing a shot at American forces. The condition of these soldiers told its own story. They were starving, exhausted, mentally broken. Years of total war had stripped them of identity, purpose, and belief. Officers no longer enforced discipline because discipline itself had lost meaning. Orders contradicted reality. Loyalty had become irrelevant. The German war machine, once praised for efficiency and precision, had turned inward and consumed itself. In this environment, surrender was not weakness, it was clarity. It was the recognition that the system no longer functioned. Yet exhaustion alone does not explain the sheer scale of surrender. Behind the advancing front lines, the United States had been fighting a different kind of war, a war of perception. From the very beginning of the Allied invasion of Europe, American planners invested heavily in deception. Inflatable tanks, rubber trucks, fake airfields, phantom divisions created through sound effects, radio traffic, and staged movements. These illusions were not crude tricks. They were carefully engineered psychological weapons designed to manipulate enemy intelligence. German commanders consistently overestimated American strength. They believed massive forces were positioned where none existed. They delayed counterattacks. They withdrew from defensible positions. Entire units surrendered because they believed resistance was already pointless. In some cases, German soldiers surrendered to American positions defended by only a handful of troops, convinced they were facing overwhelming numbers just beyond their line of sight. The battlefield had become a theater, and the Americans controlled the script. By April 1945, surrender reached levels never seen before in modern warfare. In that single month alone, more than 2.6 million German soldiers laid down their arms to American forces. These armies were not destroyed, they were absorbed. The United States processed prisoners with industrial efficiency. Disarmament was systematic. Registration was precise, transportation was organized, camps were established rapidly, designed not for punishment, but for control. By the end of the war, approximately 1.6 million German soldiers had been captured by the United States. For many prisoners, the shock was immediate. American prisoner of war camps were unlike anything they had experienced. The outlay itself enforced order. Movement was controlled through space, not violence. Routines were rigid. Food arrived on schedule. Medical treatment was provided regardless of rank. Guards were few, yet escapes were rare. Discipline was maintained not through fear, but through structure. The system worked so efficiently that resistance simply felt pointless. German prisoners often remarked on the silence. No screaming, no chaos, no brutality, just process. For soldiers who had lived under constant stress, this calm was deeply unsettling. The war had ended for them, but the machine continued to function flawlessly. The realization was unavoidable. They were no longer individuals fighting a war. They were components inside a system designed to neutralize them completely. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its tanks, planes, or artillery. It was organization, intelligence, logistics, the ability to transform warfare into a system so overwhelming that millions of enemy soldiers independently concluded that fighting no longer made sense. This was power exercised without spectacle, dominance achieved without gunfire, and it stands as one of the most extraordinary and unsettling military achievements in modern history.